What's happening, everybody? Ryan Thomas here, live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast uh, YouTube channel. And we are live, ready to rock and roll. So, a lot of things to do today on the show. Very excited to hop on here and dive into this Dan Hooker versus Dustin Poirier recap, if you will. It's a recap in the sense that last night this fight took place. We're here one day later discussing the fight, diving into the fight, a true all-out classic fight between Dustin Poirier and Dan Hooker. Very pumped up to dive into this one because I truly feel that this was one of the best fights in recent UFC history. It was a great out. It was really tough for me to put it in the context of, as far as watching the fight. I then start to ask myself, if this fight is one of the best fights in recent UFC history, then what are some of the others? So that's a discussion that I'm going to have on this podcast as well. A discussion that I want to dive into right here, right now, is that I have been taking fan questions, if you want to call it that, listener questions, want to call it that, diving into, those right here, right now. We'll get started off with some of those viewer and listener questions from all of the viewers and listeners of the show. So let's dive into these here. So I was on the Trainwreck Sports Instagram quite often last night, going round by round and heading into this fourth round, because I had it 29-28 going into the fourth round, not knowing how the hell this fight was going to end up. What was the judge's decision for this fight? I was very, very curious to see if a judge would exponentially just mess this up somehow, some way, as they are known to do from time to time. But first, before we dive into Dan Hooker versus Dustin Poirier and what's next for Dan Hooker and Poirier, I want to dive into some of these submitted questions that were submitted to me on the Ryan Thomas Take Instagram, at Ryan Thomas Take. So for everybody that hasn't followed me on there yet, you're missing out, because I post a lot of really cool content on there from my Instagram story or, just posts in general. So let's dive into this. First question says, really liked the running backfield episode of the TTSP episode of the podcast. They said, break down the wide receivers. So I'm assuming that most recently I put out an audio-only podcast episode on the running backs for the Buffalo Bills: Devin Singletary, Zach Moss, TJ Yeldon, Tywan Jones, diving into those guys, figuring out how much better this run game will be heading into this season in comparison to last season, which as of now, last season, as of this moment, as of this day, last year, we still had LaShawn McCoy, we still had Devin Singletary, obviously, and we had Frank Gore. It ended up being Devin Singletary and Frank Gore for the majority of the season. And I think, with all due respect to Frank Gore, as I said in that podcast episode, I think Zach Moss is a major upgrade from Frank Gore due to the fact that Frank Gore has a ton of wear and tear on those tires, and obviously is on his last legs. And Zach Moss, fresh legs, new running back, guy that can run in between the tackles. I greatly enjoy the fact that Buffalo got this player, because this was a player that I talked about a lot on the Crowd Assist podcast, where I dove into Zach Moss and his ability to run between the tackles and his ability to pass block and his ability to just run people over. That's what Buffalo is needed at that running back position. They got a thumper, if you will, a guy that can run people over, and a guy that is pretty impressive in doing so. So thank you for liking the episode, by the way. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Let's break down the wide receivers. Wide receiver-wise, obviously the Bills mightily improved. Stephon Diggs in the building, John Brown, Cole Beasley. I'm very excited to see what these three guys can do together, but I'm even more excited to find out how this wide receiver position really shakes out between players 4 to 6 or 4 to 7. However, this wide receiver position breaks out or shakes out, I'm very excited to see how it pans out, because you have Gabriel Davis, who they just drafted. You have Isaiah Hodgins, and you also have some guys that have been on the roster for a couple years now, in Robert Foster and obviously Duke Williams in the building as well. So very curious to see, how this situation plays itself out between who will make the roster beyond the starting 3, who will make the roster beyond Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, John Brown. I'm very excited to figure that out. It's a great question, and that's a little bit of a tidbit of an answer for you. Sum up your take on Dana White. Maybe this is in regards to the article that I wrote on the trainwrecksports.com website in regards to fighter pay and Dana White versus UFC fighter pay. Truly, I feel there is no sport that has a bigger pay scale issue in professional sports than mixed martial arts, in particular the UFC, because they have dumbed it down in so many ways that I articulated in the article. So go check that out on trainwrecksports.com. Check that out. As far as the article goes, I dove into it in depth. I mean, it's a beast of an article. So, the UFC, though, to sum it up, they've taken away sponsorship ability from fighters. They've taken away a lot of things from fighters that I think have been very, very frustrating for guys like me, because granted, merchandise-wise, Reebok and UFC, that deal was great, but for the fighters, it sucked. And Dana White, he's done so many great things for the sport of mixed martial arts, but at the same time, I think that there's things that he has done that have really hampered the fighters in a lot of ways, in particular within the fighter pay situation. And you have guys like Jorge Masvidal, you have guys like John Jones, you have all these guys coming out of the woodwork saying that, hey, what the hell? I mean, we deserve our cake. We deserve our prize. And the prize fighters, at the end of the day, they're fighting for money. They're not fighting for anything else. Any fighter that tells you that they're fighting for more than just money, they're lying. That they want money. You don't get punched in the head for nothing. So that's my take on that. New divisions in the UFC. What weight classes would you add? That's a very interesting question. What weight classes would I add to mixed martial arts? In particular, I think there is a need for a 165-pound weight class. There's a lot of guys that could fight really well at 170 that would, be too small for 155, or too big, I should say, too big for 155. That would be just right. A Donald Cerrone, for example, would be perfect at 165. I think Conor McGregor would be perfect at 165. Those are some examples for you. New divisions in the UFC that you would add, those are the divisions that I would add outside. Well, 165, and the other one that I would add would be somewhat of a cruiserweight division, like a 225, to just be that median between light heavyweight and heavyweight. I think that would be really cool as well. Our fantasy baseball draft is today. Who you picking, bud? One of my good buddies, Adam, on the fantasy baseball side of things, asking me who I'm going to pick. I'm not going to tell you who I'm going to pick. And what makes things so difficult in my fantasy baseball league is that it's a deep keeper league, 10 keepers per team. So 80 players are already off the board heading into the draft. So you really have to sift through the talent in the first 2 rounds, maybe reach for a player that you normally wouldn't take, a player that you might take in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th round that you reach for in the 1st or 2nd round. So I'm very much looking forward to this draft. It's at 6:00 today. I'll be giving you some tidbits on it today as well. So very pumped up for that. So those are the 5 questions that I chose to dive into for the folks at home that are tuning into this podcast. So now let's dive into the subject matter at hand. Dustin Poirier versus Dan Hooker. When this fight was first announced, I knew that this would be a barn burner fight. Both of these guys stylistically just create fireworks. If you've watched every and any Dan Hooker fight, it's entertaining. If you've watched any and every Dustin Poirier fight, it's entertaining. These guys are appeasing to every mixed martial arts fan. whether they're a casual fan, whether they're a longtime hardcore fan. Both Dustin Poirier and Dan Hooker are fun to watch. So knowing that these guys were matched up with one another, I knew very well that this would be a firefight, that this would be one that would get people talking. And it was. When that fight was first announced, everybody's, jerked back. Everybody jerked back a little bit. Everybody's hair on their arms stood up a little bit. Every gentleman that is a diehard UFC fight fan was like, hey, holy shit, man, this fight's gonna be freaking awesome. And it delivered, and then some, and then some. I've racked my brain within the last, 8 hours, I guess you could say, or 10 hours, of what fights have been phenomenal fights in UFC history. I mean, Griffin versus Bonner is the first one that comes to mind. Lawler versus Rory McDonald 2 is the next one that comes to mind. Dan Hooker and Dustin Poirier, I would say, was the closest thing to Rory McDonald and Robbie Lawler Part 2 that I have ever seen. This was a toe-to-toe battle, and everything was on the line for these guys. You really have to paint the picture and put things into perspective. If Dustin Poirier lost, it would have been devastating to his career. If Dan Hooker loses, it's devastating to his career, because you got to take that step back. Granted, I think both of these guys are so damn good that they would be able to get right back into the title mix, into the title picture, with a quick, victory. They lose. Let's just say for the reality of it, Dan Hooker lost this fight last night. Lost on all three judges' scorecards. I thought the 48-46 was a little bit ridiculous. There's never a moment when I'm watching a UFC fight where, the judge's decision is rendered, and I agree with every single judge. It's extremely rare. I'm talking like, 1% of the time. Usually these judges are just garbage. And a 48-46, I think Dan Hooker deserved a little bit better than that. Unanimous decision even was a little bit surprising. A split decision victory for Dustin Poirier, I would have said, okay. Granted, though, that fifth and final round, you look at the round by round facets of that fight. I have the fight stats right in front of me here. Total strikes, Dustin Poirier landed 208 out of 289. He landed 72% of his strikes, whereas Dan Hooker was 182 out of 283. He landed 64% of his total strikes. Significant strikes. These guys were extremely close. I'm talking 2 punches difference. Poirier at 153 and Hooker at 155. Takedowns, Dan Hooker got 4 takedowns. Dustin Poirier had 4 submission attempts. So this fight went anywhere and everywhere. This fight was a complete mixed martial arts fight, not just a stand-up war, not just a ground battle. This fight was a war where both guys had to really dig deep and pull some tricks out of their sleeve, I should say, and just go throw down. And anyone that watched that fight last night came away a bigger UFC mixed martial arts fan. If you didn't, shame on you, because that was a hell of a fight. And, we'll dive into the winner and loser right here, right now. Dustin Poirier, the winner of this fight, is back. There's no doubt about it. He's back. A tough opponent, and Dan Hooker standing across from him gave him everything that he could have in order to win that fight. Dan Hooker should not hang his head in this loss. Definitely shouldn't hang his head. Dustin Poirier just had that little bit extra of veteran experience, and that is what I saw in that fight last night. The championship rounds, not that Dan Hooker had never fought, 5-minute rounds before. He's trained for 5-minute rounds for the last, 6 to 8 months. But in that fight, in the heat of battle, Dustin Poirier just turned it on just a little bit extra. And that little bit extra in the 4th and 5th championship rounds was really what counted in that fight last night. And I think that was what had me saying, yeah, Dustin Poirier won that fight. At one point heading into the 4th, I did have Dan Hooker winning it 2-1. Then the fourth, Poirier won the fourth, and he sure as heck won the fifth. So 5-minute rounds, 25-minute fight. That's where things start to change. If this was a 15-minute fight, Dan Hooker would have won last night. It was a 5-minute round UFC main event, and Dustin Poirier showed that interim championship ability for him to be able to weather the storm, push forward, push ahead, and win this in championship fashion. Win it in a championship format. And for an interim lightweight champ, former interim lightweight champ, what a feather in the cap that this victory is. It's a huge feather in the cap, because not only is Dan Hooker a tough son of a bitch, he's beaten X amount of fighters in a row. He's been on a tear. The way Dustin Poirier won this fight has to be so gratifying and so dignifying for Dustin Poirier to push forward now and say, hey, I belong here. I am miles and leaps and bounds away from the Conor McGregor knockout loss that I suffered 6 years ago. I'm a completely different fighter than what I was. Nobody made that happen but me, regardless as to whether or not Dustin Poirier has Mike Brown in his corner. Mike Brown, one of the best. You want to talk about one of the best coaches in MMA? Mike Brown, one of the best. Former WEC champ. Mike Brown, phenomenal what they're doing at American Top Team, by the way. But Dustin Poirier had to flip the script and turn the switch on to get that next edge in his career and in this fight. And he's done that. So, I had some doubts as to whether Dustin Poirier would be able to come back from that Khabib loss, because it was a demoralizing defeat. He had Khabib in a choke. It was a tight choke. Khabib gets out of it, and then shortly after, Dustin Poirier gets choked and submitted and is forced to tap. So the facts are the facts that, I did, go on record saying I thought Dan Hooker was going to win this fight. And for a little while, I looked like I was going to be right. For a little bit, I looked like I was on the right path. But Dustin Poirier proved to me last night that he has that championship mentality to kick it into the extra gear. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what's next for Dustin Poirier. I'm really looking forward to it. I've seen things in regards to Dustin Poirier versus Tony Ferguson. I don't know if that quite makes a whole lot of sense. You do the MMA math of it, it really doesn't make sense, because Tony Ferguson lost to Justin Gaethje. Dustin Poirier beat Justin Gaethje. And I don't know if Tony is really quite ready for that fight, to be quite honest, given the damage that he took in the fight versus Justin Gaethje. I don't know if Poirier is ready for that fight, given the damage that he took to Dan Hooker. I mean, maybe their timelines will meet in the middle, but I happen to think that Khabib versus Gaethje goes down. Whoever wins that fight, we're not going to say if Khabib wins. We're not going to say if Gaethje wins. Whoever wins it. Between the two, we're not going to pick a winner. It's disrespectful. Khabib, Gaethje, that fight goes down, and Dustin Poirier should fight the winner of that fight, in my opinion. With that performance over Dan Hooker, I don't think Dustin Poirier needs 2 wins to get back in there. What would really make sense for Dustin Poirier is if fight fans feel that he needs another win to get back into title contention. My nose is just itchy. For the viewers out there, I'm not picking my nose. I'm just itching it. Dustin Poirier has a fight that he needs to rectify. The only question mark of his career, essentially, is that loss to Conor McGregor. I feel, rather than Dustin Poirier fighting Tony Ferguson, Dustin Poirier versus Conor McGregor 2 makes as much sense as any fight in the 155-pound division, and argue that's his last true devastating loss to Conor, And Conor needs to get another win before he gets a shot at Khabib. I think Conor needs to get another win more than Poirier does, obviously, because Poirier just beat Dan Hooker. Conor beat Donald Cerrone at 170 pounds. With all due respect to Conor, I'm not taking that win away from him. But Donald Cerrone, and with all due respect to Donald Cerrone, I love Donald Cerrone, but I think Cerrone is on his last legs. And a win at 170, he hasn't won a fight at 155 since 2016. So you really put things in perspective in that way. I think Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier makes a ton of sense. A ton of sense. A whole lot more sense than Dustin Poirier versus Tony Ferguson. And for Dan Hooker, I mean, we'll pull up the UFC rankings. We'll dive into, what's next for Dan Hooker. I mean, Dan Hooker's not going anywhere. If Dan Hooker proved one thing and one thing only, he deserves a seat at the big dog table. I mean, that guy is tough as nails. Tough as nails. And you look at the, UFC lightweight rankings now, I think Dustin Poirier is going to get a bump. Might move up to number 2. Right now, he's slotted at number 3. Let's see. Dan Hooker's at 5. I mean, he beat Paul Felder. Beat Ali Quinta. I mean, maybe you put Dan Hooker in there with Tony Ferguson. I think that makes more sense than Poirier versus Ferguson. I don't know. I just don't feel like Poirier and Ferguson makes a ton of sense to me right now. Because I think Poirier earned the ability to fight Conor again or wait for the Khabib Gaethje fight. I think whoever won that fight was in the... And then you got the knuckleheads out there that actually think that Conor McGregor is retired. Are you nuts? Do you think Santa Claus is real? Do you think the tooth fairy is real? Do you put a tooth under your pillow at night and think a fairy is going to fly through your window? Come on. Conor McGregor is not retired. It's all Fugazi. In the words of Wolf of Wall Street, Matthew McConaughey, Fugazi, it's a wazi, it's a wizzy, it's fairy dust. It's not real. It's fake. Conor is not retired. He's not going anywhere. He's the furthest thing from retired. I guarantee it. So that to me makes sense. Poirier versus McGregor 2, Hooker versus Ferguson. I'm cool with it. I'm cool with it. Or if you wanted to get, a little bit analytical, you could do maybe Kevin Lee versus Dan Hooker. I think Hooker would love that fight, and I know Kevin Lee would too. So, there's matchups out there still. And Dan Hooker, this guy is so down on himself after that fight. I saw he was really dejected. He moves to 20-9 as a pro, but regardless, he's 30 years old, in the prime of his career, and fights tooth and nails, balls to the wall, and people like that. Dan Hooker will always have a place in the UFC in terms of how that fight went down. It was a legendary fight. That fight set him in stone as a key fighter in this 155-pound division. So there is my recap for UFC Fight Night. Dustin Poirier versus Dan Hooker. Thank you so much for joining me on the audio side of things. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts as well, right here on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast YouTube channel. We stream this on the We Meaning Me, stream this on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast YouTube, and then it goes to the cloud. Goes to Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Google Podcasts. So greatly enjoyed recapping the fights for you on here. I've greatly enjoyed adding more content to this podcast as well over the last few weeks right here, right now on the YouTube channel. If you guys got any more questions for me that you want to submit, when I post a create post that says add questions or ask me questions, ask me some questions. I'm getting 5 to 10 questions. I want more questions so that I can save them for the next show. And then I can shout you guys out, get you guys to tune in, all that fun stuff. And it's a pay it forward process right here on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. So thank you so much for tuning in. For more, stay tuned and stay safe.